Welcome to our coffee chat, which is called Preparing for the Next Crisis. Coffee chat with CGAP experts. My name is Archie Bakuradze. I'm MFC board member and the chair and founder of Georgia's leading NBFI, Crystal. It's a great privilege for me to introduce our distinguished panel today, which is comprised of two experts from CGAP, consultative group to assist the poorest, I think known universally by anybody working in the financial inclusion industry. And we also have a regulator representing Albania. And let me just make a quick introduction of our speakers. We have today from CGAP, Stefan Staschen, who is a policy expert based in Berlin. Stefan leads CGAP's work on regulation and supervision. He has more than 20 years of experience working on financial inclusion, focusing on policy and regulatory issues in microfinance and digital financial services. He has worked with numerous regulators and supervisors, primarily in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, but also in Central and Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and Arab countries. Before joining CGAP in 2016, Stefan worked for 15 years as an independent consultant on inclusive financial policy and lived for several years in the UK, Kenya, and Turkey. Stefan has a doctorate degree from the London School of Economics and master's degree in economics from the Free University in Berlin. Stefan, welcome to our talk. It's great to have you today. And before you make introductory remarks, let me introduce our two very important members of this panel. Eric Duflo, Senior Financial Sector Specialist from CGAP. He leads work on consumer protection from policy, industry, and consumer perspectives, ensuring that financial services have positive outcomes for our customers. Eric has 25 years of experience in advancing financial inclusion and economic development. His most recent position was Director of the Office for UN Secretary General's Special Advocate for Inclusive Finance for Development with Her Majesty Queen Maxima of the Netherlands, where he managed a team of staff and consultants working on fintech and digital finance for underserved segments. Before joining CGAP, Eric worked 7 years in the Lao PDR to support the emergence of financial inclusion with UNCDF, the Bank of Lao PDR, and the World Bank. He holds a master's degree in management from EM Lyon and master's in economics and international relations from SAIS Johns Hopkins University. So again, Eric, welcome and thank you for joining this coffee chat. And obviously, last but not least, we have a pleasure to welcome Denis Darala, who is a director of supervision department at Bank of Albania and board member of the Albanian Financial Supervisory Authority. He has a background in banking sector, including Credins Bank and Opportunity Albania. And prior, he has an experience with Big Four, KPMG. Denis's educational background include University of Tirana, Faculty of Economic Sciences, Finance, as well as Polytechnic University of Tirana, Faculty of Mechanical Engineering. Denis, welcome and thank you very much for your time. So, gentlemen, as a very brief introduction, I want probably to set a scene and say that pandemics, alongside the wars and famine, have always been a part of modern human history. But for finance sector, this is something new and quite unexpected, I think. While we have proven, while we as a sector have proven our resilience to external shocks, to adverse economic cycles, man-made or natural disasters, we've never had such event. We've never anticipated really that type of crisis to unfold. Now, more than a year from the start of the pandemic, when we have a vaccine available, breakthrough variants spreading, and the crisis is still not fully closed, I would say, not even sort of maybe partly closed. However, we can start already seeing some potential development scenarios. We get more confidence about how it can evolve, and we can start reflecting on what have actually happened with us and whether or not we learn anything from this experience. So today our talk will be dedicated to mainly policy responses we've seen across the border, and we'll be also looking at specific country examples of how they approach this challenge of debt relief and moratoria. But before, let me ask Stefan to tell us more about what is sort of give us an overall introduction. What is his thought about how we come to this point? So, Stefan, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Archel. It's great to be reconnected with MFC again. And thanks for the nice introduction. Even if not in person, but and in difficult times, but I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion. And I think it's also a great opportunity for Eric and me to share some of the work CGAP did in response to the pandemic. As many of you probably know, CGAP has close association with the microfinance sector, has had for a very long time. So when the pandemic hit, we actually changed some of our work program and thought it would be important for us to look at the specific effects of the pandemic on the microfinance sector, on MFIs, because we believe, as you all know, they play an extremely important role in local economies, in household resilience, and serving some of the most vulnerable people. And we saw a bit of a risk of them falling through the cracks in the response, which was very much, as you know, it's a global pandemic, so it was also very much focused on what happens in the banking sector when people were talking about financial sector. So looking back, I must say, and I just do this as an introduction, and we can go into more detail during the Q&A, regulators had to respond very quickly, and many did. So I think overall, I would say regulators did a great job in responding at very short notice in unprecedented circumstances. And the impact on the sector has been, in many cases, less severe than anticipated, but still problems arose and are still arising, and we can talk about some of that in more detail. Just to say, the problems are serious enough to warrant our attention. In general, there are two main effects of the pandemic, one on the clients, the microfinance clients, and one on the MFIs, and they're interrelated. And one thing we looked at is how to keep a balance between these two. So there was a bit of talk about who carries the heaviest burden in the response. And I think we are all quite clear that it shouldn't be the clients who are most vulnerable. But even if it's not the clients, we still need the MFIs. It's not like we can shift all the burden to the providers. Just a few words on the general measures we saw in the regulatory responses to the pandemic. And surprisingly, they are, or maybe not surprisingly, but they are very relatively similar to what you saw in the banking sector. So there was the part of relief to the clients, relief to microfinance clients. It was a lot about debt relief and moratoria, loan restructuring, protecting borrowers' credit histories. Eric will elaborate on those, so I just mentioned them briefly here. But then on the side of the MFIs, many regulators also saw, and governments, policymakers more broadly, that there was a need for relief, to provide relief to MFIs, because they suddenly didn't see much repayments coming in, and so they needed liquidity support, and which they got in many cases. In some cases, they got guarantees for fresh lending. There were temporary changes in prudential standards, and there's a long list, and we have done a bit of a survey of those, and we can go into some of the details. But it's like reduction of collateral, provisioning changes, even capital adequacy rules have been lowered. some changes in supervisory activities, non-essential reporting, all these things happened. But microfinance is different. So, and I'm just mentioning it here, and we can go into details. It has not always worked perfectly because the responses were generally the same as for the banking sector. And microfinance is different in terms of customers, in terms of kind of financial technology used to serve the customers, the products offered. And so there has been some challenges in implementing regulatory responses. Let me stop there as the first introduction into the topic.
Introduction, and already opens a lot of good questions. But before we go to questions, let's listen to Eric. What is his take on overall experience so far? Eric, please.
Thank you very much, Artil, and thanks to the NFC for inviting us to this conference. So Stefan has given you the big picture on some of the policy actions. On my side, as the lead on consumer protection, I wanted our team to look at more specifically on what was happening with low-income borrowers. So, to make a very long story short, CGAP conducted research in 3 countries on low-income borrowers, and the bottom line is that we were actually focusing on the effect of debt moratoria on low-income borrowers. So it's a very subset of all these interventions that we were looking at. So we went in depth into understanding what was happening to borrowers through the debt moratoria, which were applied in over 115 countries globally. So this was a measure that became very popular. And the bottom line of this research is that debt moratoria have actually provided a great relief, and they have helped millions of low-income borrowers. So it's been a very positive policy intervention overall, and we found the same thing in the 3 countries we looked at more closely, India, Peru, and Uganda. But these measures also came with some challenges for providers and also for consumers. I think we saw some consumer protection issues appearing in the implementation of the debt moratoria. And, we can talk a little more about this later on, but that's my bottom line. A great relief with some issues that probably could be solved next time, it is implemented.
Thank you very much. I think this is really an excellent paper, as usual, coming from CGAP. And for those who listen to us, I would recommend to have a look at it. It's called Debt Relief in the Pandemic, Lessons from India, Peru, and Uganda, December 2020. So it was quite sort of quick turnaround of the whole analysis. And I think it's just very good insights about what has been done, and very rich analysis of various aspects of this policy interventions. But since we sort of geographic coverage doesn't include Europe or Eastern Europe, I think we have a wonderful opportunity to listen to Denis, who is now can practically speak on behalf of that region, coming from Albania. And Denis, can you please give us also a brief overview of your take and your experience of pandemic and the way how you managed it as a regulator?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation as MFC, and it's a pleasure to be with all you in this panel. As a consequence of the hit to the small businesses, to the micro enterprises, to the individuals that are self-employed, definitely the microfinance sector was the sector that felt the most the pandemic situation in Albania from all the financial sector. And in the beginning, also microfinance institutions has been part of the moratoria that the Bank of Albania and the government of Albania decided since March of 2020 for 3 months. And by the end of this period, we saw that firstly, the banks needs another period of moratoria, But meantime, the microfinance institutions, if we decided to include also them in this moratoria, had to feel very bad in a difficult situation due to lack of liquidity, due to lack of capital. We decided as Bank of Albania to not include the microfinance institutions in this second moratoria, but meantime to allow them to restructured loans case by case based on their analysis, their judgment. And meantime, they didn't have to do provisions on this, new provisions on these loans. So giving a little bit more opportunities to the microfinance institutions to follow the line with the clients, but meantime not having additional costs to reflect the situation. And the fact was that this was very well accepted by microfinance institutions. Definitely, we have been in follow-up all the time with them. And I think that this was really appreciated by the microfinance institution. Meantime, we didn't have the same situation with the Albanian government because even the microfinance institutions wants from the government to be included in the schemes that the Albanian government creates at the time. They didn't include the microfinance institutions even as partners in these schemes, but not only as last beneficiaries of this scheme. So the situation with the government was not that good. But I think that the microfinance institution in Albania survived by this situation. The fact was that mostly 32% of the portfolio was restructured, and almost 77 million, as I remember, of the 77 million of euros has been restructured. Almost 40,000 clients from the clients of the microfinance institutions in Albania, but still they remain active in the market. They continue to lend and to increase their lending portfolio. Also, in the next months after the lockdown in Albania, which was till the August of 2020.
Very interesting. Actually, what you said somehow echoes Stefan's initial comment that there was a need to have a specific tailored response to microfinance organizations, and I'm not I'm not surprised by the fact that governments might not have enough time to react properly. But let's go back to Stefan and ask him what was the really response for the microfinance organizations and their clients. What was, I mean, there was something obviously done for the banking sector, but there was or should be something done for microfinance sector, right? So maybe we start with the measures which you've seen, and maybe tell us more about whether or not these measures were effective.
Yeah, thanks. I'm happy to do that. So one thing is the term microfinance is a bit problematic in the first place. And actually in the writing, if you look at the writing, the papers we have published on microfinance and COVID, we use the term microfinance providers because in many countries, MFI has a very specific term, but then we all know if it's about serving low-income people, it's often a range of different institutions doing that. So some of them are banks in many countries, and the banks are obviously subject to the same kind of relief measures as any other bank. Some of them are separate types of regulated financial institutions. They might be subject to different rules. So what Denis just mentioned from Albania, it seems like some of the relief measures didn't include MFIs. And we have seen that in other markets. Also, in some cases, you have a different regulator being in charge. And then there's even a third group, which is non-regulated MFIs, which are, is a big part of the financial sector. It's like, if you think about all the credit cooperatives, very important in serving poor people in many markets, they are often very lightly or not regulated at all. So they might not benefit from the same relief measures. So that was one lesson we saw. So we actually came up with 5 principles in policy response, and one was broad coverage. Don't forget any type of institution serving the low-income sector and how they are affected. Another thing is credit-only versus deposit-taking institutions. You also have those differences, and you have different regulatory frameworks. And we actually saw that the deposit-taking institutions fared better in the crisis on a general level. Obviously, different degrees, exceptions to the rule, but I think on a general level, they fared better, which is interesting also, I think, from a regulatory perspective, because it might call for more regulators to allow for deposit-taking MFIs or create some accommodating, enabling legal framework for deposit-taking MFIs. I think these are main differences.
I think your term, which you used, finance service providers, is probably more accurate term. I agree with you. We can let's use these terms interchangeably, I think, but we understand that our focus is really a part of financial sector which is focused on underserved market, let's say, or low-income people, something which all of our sector, financial inclusion sector, is primarily preoccupied with. So that's very good, and thank you for highlighting this. But let me now go back to Eric and ask him, I mean, maybe these 3 countries example, India, Peru, and Uganda, they are pretty different, the way how regulators responded. But do you see any trend in how countries responded? Do you see any typical responses, and could you sort of categorize them for us? Because that would help us to really understand how also others respond to this crisis. So what are the key trends of responses? If you can explain to us in terms of debt relief moratorium and whether from this country or any other country you have encountered.
Yeah, so I think when we look at the 3 countries, first they have different situations in terms of COVID. If you take Peru, at some stage it had the highest number of deaths per inhabitant, so very much affected by the COVID. At the same time, if you look at India, I don't know where it is now, but at some stage it was the 2nd highest number of deaths from COVID in terms of volume of people who died. So Peru and India were very massively affected by the COVID. Whereas Uganda, when we did the research, by November 2020, they only had 1,000 people who died from COVID. So different situations. In the research, we looked at low-income segments, and one thing I would say is that the 3 countries. In the 3 countries, we saw that low-income segment borrowers were really affected. Even in Uganda, they were affected. So, for example, in India, 57% of low-income borrowers say that their payment and repayment obligations were a burden. In Uganda, 53% responded that their payment, became a burden. In Peru, we don't have the exact figure for repayments, but 61% of survey respondents said they had stopped paying utility payments. So we have massive, sort of poverty issue. Not to mention that globally there is, according to the World Bank, an increase in more than 110 million people who fell into poverty in 2020. Now, when it comes to the response from the countries. The 3 countries, more or less adopted a debt moratoria at the same time around March, April 2020. That means basically that consumers wouldn't have to pay back their loan, that they would continue to pay interest, but it was a great relief in terms of burden for the borrowers. Now, the way it was done was different from one country to the other. And that created different, pathways. For example, Uganda made it very clear that this was a case-by-case situation, that a customer who was in difficulty could discuss with the institution, I can't pay back my loan for now, let's restructure it, and I'll continue to pay the interest. In India, the situation was that the RBI said you can have a debt, you can restructure the loans, but then a lot of the non-bank financial companies, NBFCs and MFIs, decided to do more of a blanket moratoria. So that means everybody, had to stop paying back their loan, which not everybody wanted to.
Which one was more successful? Can you say
sorry?
that? Can you say which approach was most successful, blanket or?
Yeah. Well, I would say from our perspective, because Peru was even more complicated, I would say. So from our perspective, we concluded that it's better for people to have a choice and very clearly know that they have a choice, because there was a lot of confusion in the blanket moratoria. People did not really understand. We had evidence that in some countries people were completely lost with the measure being taken. So I think the Uganda case, in my opinion, was actually probably more interesting, where it had to be a transparent process, given that the financial service provider would clearly ask the question to the customer: do you want to restructure your loan? So I think that's the case that I actually like the most.
I you a little bit on that, because imagine that sort of 1 month remaining when next payment should be done, complete sort of chaos, pandemic, and you have to communicate with hundreds of thousands of customers. Yeah. So and you've perfectly described in your paper these challenges with communication, with inability to really let people know about the decision of the institution. So from that perspective, when there are logistical challenges of doing that, don't you think the blanket moratorium would be the good choice? But without discriminating the choice of the customer. So those who do not want to stop paying, they could opt out from the scheme. Would you think that blanket in that sense was quite a good idea?
Well, the way I define blanket is that it's kind of imposed to all customers. So the notion you've discussed, the blanket sort of with a choice, I think that as long as the customer has the full choice, of continuing to pay their loan or stopping to pay, interrupting their repayments, I think for me that's the most important. So whether you call it blanket or other terms, I would say it's critical that customers can choose if they want to continue to pay or not. And on the communication issue that you mentioned, I would say if this was, I said that there were customer protection issues, related with this successful story overall. I think communication was a big issue, both for providers and for regulators and supervisors. So this is one big bucket of problems that appeared during the implementation of the debt moratoria. A lot of MFIs did not have the means to communicate with their clients. Sometimes the communication between the regulator and the financial service providers was not totally clear. So they were breakups in communication that really created issues. Just in Uganda, I just realized that I think I read that 44% of the low-income borrowers did not have a phone. So how can you communicate in COVID time, in these conditions? It was very, very challenging for everybody. So I would not put the blame. It was such a challenging environment.
You also mentioned about the technical IT capabilities. Many of the FSP's systems were not ready to introduce such type of product like a moratorium. It looked like nothing. And I think you've got this fascinating comparative analysis of how accrued interest matter was resolved. Sometimes it was burden was put on customers, sometimes on organizations itself, but Indian courts decided that neither of them were in charge, so government decided to cover the difference. And Georgia had the same issue, actually. And I'm quite pleased to say that customers were not put a burden of interest on interest, let's say. So the capitalization of interest didn't happen, which is great. Before we go back to Stefan and maybe ask him to highlight other measures which we've seen during the crisis, rather than a moratorium, let's now go back to Albania and ask Denis, how have you managed that? What was your choice, and how do you see from today's perspective? Did it work well, and could you do it slightly better if you had another chance? Yeah, I think you are muted. So please unmute your mic.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. As Eric says, looks that we choose the same manner as Uganda. So the moratoria we have done, in fact, was some reviews of our regulations on financial institutions. And we decided that for 3 months, all the financial institutions had not to reclassify the unpaid loans as loans in delay. So we allowed them not to face in the register, in the credit register, these loans as bad loans. And meantime, not to do provision on the loans not paid during that period of time. So we allowed financial institutions to deal with the clients and to restructure loans without any additional cost. And the fact was that, as I say, only 32% of portfolio has been restructured during this time of the financial institutions. But in general, also for the banking system was almost the same percentage. So only people that has been hit by the situation, by the pandemic situation, by the lockdown, has choose to not repay back the loan. Definitely that communication was very important, as Eric said, during the time, also because the Prime Minister of Albania in an interview say that for any kind of trouble you have to send a complaint to Bank of Albania. We received like 360 cases of clients unsatisfied from the treatment of the financial institutions. But this is a good number, let's say, considering thousands of clients that received this benefit of moratoria. But other than that, we took some other measures to allow, for example, banks or financial or microfinance institutions not to report based on the deadlines they had for many things. So we allowed them to have more time to deal with the clients and to be focused on this situation, this restructuring situation, not in the routine reports or routine relationships they have with the Bank of Albania. So I think that the result was good. The fact that all the microfinances continued to land after this situation, and we didn't had too many cases of unsatisfied clients. That means that we chose the right way. Probably something was better, but I think that this one that we chose was good.
I think your focus on consumer protection is really highly appreciated, and I think that should be probably your primary mandate. But coming back to financial stability aspect of the regulation, how would you categorize this crisis? Was it more a liquidity crisis, or was it more solvency crisis? And were you worried about the liquidity issues more than the sort of capital erosion due to the provisioning which was necessary to be done?
Yeah, definitely that was a liquidity issue, first of all. For the microfinance institutions in Albania, we have no microfinance institutions that took deposits. So they respond only with capital and probably also for some of them was a problem of capital adequacy. But we didn't have any complaint from shareholders or from other parts due to the capital. Definitely the main problem that microfinance institutions may have faced was lack of liquidity at the time.
Interestingly, in Georgia, for example, this crisis was not seen as a liquidity crisis because, surprisingly, liquidity haven't gone out of the system. In fact, banks observed greater liquidity after the crisis, and obviously, microfinance sector, which is also non-deposit taking, didn't have any problem due to the support of our traditional lenders. But everybody were fearful of how these massive write-offs and restructurings would reflect on the quality of assets, provisioning, capital. And what you say about more than 30% restructuring seems quite a lot. We had much less, but we still were worrying about how would this result. However, obviously, the capital buffers and capital requirements before the crisis definitely worked, because at a difficult time, they've been duly utilized, and with quite heavy provisions, overall majority of institutions had no problem with capital adequacy. And now going back to Stefan, was capital controls one of those measures which you see worked successfully, or anything else you want to highlight in terms of how regulators manage that crisis apart of moratoriums?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. And let me do that also by looking ahead a bit, how what lessons to learn for future crises. And I think one thing you have seen, and Denis mentioned it, is changes in the supervisory approach. So there has been deferment of some of the activities which are non-essential. And that includes reporting. I think that's what you mentioned, Denis. But at the same time, it doesn't mean, like, we're talking a lot about relaxation and giving relief, both to clients and MFIs. But at the same time, I think there were enhanced risks, and this is very important to look after and to be careful. And one is on the consumer protection side, which was already mentioned. So there have been cases of fraud and scams and all of that, which increased in the crisis because there was opportunity to commit more fraud without close enforcement from the regulator. And I think there are also there were relief measures in terms of like changing prudential requirements, but at the same time, what is important in the longer term, you need to know the health of the credit portfolios. As a supervisor and also provider, obviously, you're also interested in knowing the real health of your credit portfolio. And if you have these relief measures, how do you get out of them? How do you exit relief measures and get back to regular reporting and transparency in the portfolio quality? That's one lesson, I think, where it's important that MFIs are able to continue reporting on the real quality of the portfolio, so that even taking into account moratoria, so that any liquidity problems that might get into solvency problems are seen early enough and responded to. One last point, I think, often regulators and supervisors focus on systemic institutions, but I think that's one difference also in microfinance. Some of these institutions might not be systemic from a broad, like looking at asset size, for example, from a broad perspective. But at the same time, they're incredibly important to serve a large part of the population. And I think it's important to think about how to help those institutions, how to resolve them in an orderly fashion in case they get into trouble, so that customers continue to enjoy their services. And so there is a bit of a different definition of systemic needed in microfinance, I would say.
Thank you very much. This was very insightful. Maybe as we're closing our session, I would like to ask a question, and maybe start with Eric and then come back to Stefan. Is not really so much about crisis, but is there anything which you think countries and markets and regulators learned from this experience, which would be helpful and useful in a normal life. So not life which we're now facing, hopefully, and entering this normal stage pretty soon. So is there anything we learned which would be used positively as a way forward? And I would like to start with Eric.
Yeah, I think, I don't know who said that, the crisis we can learn from a crisis quite a bit. And in fact, after we wrote this paper with Beth Ryan that you mentioned, I saw a blog by Bill Gates about preparing for the next pandemic, which I thought was a very interesting blog, and I got inspired. And Beth and I wrote a blog on how do we prepare for next time. So I think there are things we have learned through this experience that will be useful both for the normal time, but also for the next pandemic. Because I think we will see something like this happen again, and we need to be prepared. On the communication, very clearly, this is something that needs to be improved, both from the regulators and FSPs, communicating more proactively with consumers, using different tools, whether it's social media, phone. We have to be creative on this. The other thing is, I would say it's an opportunity for FSPs to realize how important it is to digitize their system, because those FSPs, financial service providers, who were the most digitized, did the best, both in terms of managing the actual, sort of complicated sort of mathematic issue, and also the communication. So, digitization for me, it was like a wake-up call for some of the FSPs.
Excellent.
So I think that's one thing. And the other one is for the regulator is monitoring the market in real time. I think this is particularly interesting. We found in India, for example, during this COVID research, that there were some issues with some consumers using digital credits right during the COVID. And we're actually doing more research now on this front, and we're finding some issues related with consumer protection. So it's critical in times like this, but also at all times for regulators and supervisors more specifically, and market conduct authorities to really monitor the markets, to be able to troubleshoot when there are issues. In terms of there is a future moratoria. Very important to give the right to the consumer to accept or not. So, what we discussed before, and also what you mentioned, Archil, about the India case. Something needs to be done about who takes up the costs of the moratoria. And the India case that is in the paper is an interesting one.
A very good summary. Thank you very much. A lot of learning points for the future. Denis, what would be your main takeaways and positive learning points from this crisis?
I fully support the Eric idea on digitalization. Definitely was one of the main sources on this time that support not only the institutions to continue their work, but also the clients to receive the benefits from financial institutions. And definitely this brings also reduction of cost, administrative costs, and things that had to support the difficult situation of financial institutions. One of the points that I think is very important and had to have more results in Albania was the relationship of MFIs with the government. I think that has not been considered from the government as a real player in the financial market, which is a very bad choice, let's say, of the Albanian government, because definitely the microfinance institutions in Albania are the institutions that brings the financial services to the lowest level, to the segments that are, unserved by banks. I cannot say are unbanked, but definitely are unserved by banks. So that must be considered as one of the weakest points of MFIs in Albania, and they should continue working on that situation.
Excellent, excellent. I think this is very interesting, and thank you for your very good assessment. Maybe last one sentence comment from Stefan before we wrap up, as we are approaching our time limit.
Yeah, I can be very brief because I agree with a lot of what has been said. So let me raise two more points, which I think might be lessons. One is there is regulatory and supervisory fragmentation in many markets. And I think that's important to think about how to regulate across, which might also mean thinking about how to bring in large non-profit MFIs into the regulatory perimeter, which is not always the case, including deposit taking. I know that's in the region MFC is working on. It's not that common that MFIs are actually deposit taking. And the last one, which is kind of obvious, but it comes to the fore again, it's supervisory capacity and data, which is extremely important. So there have been supervisors which simply didn't know what was happening in the market because they didn't get regular reports and they didn't have the capacity to analyze. That's the flip side, obviously, of reporting capacity on the part of the providers.
Thank you very much for a very insightful conversation. I think we had a very good coffee chat. Look forward to continuing at a certain stage, and have an excellent rest of the day. Thank you very much.